All right, Dons, here we go. Section 12.1, the politics of Reconstruction. All right, so we're going to talk about presidential and congressional Reconstruction policies from 1865 to 1870, right, the Johnson administration. Right, the question is, how did political leaders plan on rebuilding the nation after the Civil War, right? We talked about how devastated the country was, at least the South was after the war. You know, lots of people died. You know, we had a kind of a big change in the country, and how are we going to come back from it?
And of course the issue here, coming back from the Civil War, is you're going to have a Southern Confederacy that is extremely frustrated. They are bitter, they're resentful towards the North and the United States of America. Their politicians are going to try to maintain the Southern lifestyle as much as they can, and the United States needs to figure out a way to bring them all back together and make the U.S. as a whole successful again. So there was a huge amount of social and political tension during this time period. Now, during the war, Abraham Lincoln could sort of see the end coming. Following the victory at Gettysburg and the siege of Vicksburg, Abraham Lincoln and his close counsel began to plan on an end to the war. But what was really important for Abraham Lincoln is reconstructing the United States. We talked in chapter 11 about how his goal of the war was to immediately restore the Union as quickly as possible. That is still on the forefront of his political approach. How are we going to bring the North and the South back together? And his plan showed that he really did want to bring the North and the South back together. Each Confederate state following the Civil War would have to basically reapply to be part of the United States, one by one. We didn't just accept all of them back. They had to basically meet the standards to become part of the U.S. again. Under Abraham Lincoln's plan, which of course was never fulfilled because he died before he could, he said that each Confederate state should only have to show 10% allegiance. So only 10% of their voting population would have to show allegiance to the United States of America. Additionally, he could give out vetoes based on his personal preference. It was very lenient, and it showed that Abraham Lincoln was valuing bringing the country back together over punishing the South for what they had done.
Not everyone in the country really felt that way, and a very large contingent of what we would call radical Republicans in Congress, led by Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, really didn't believe that the South should be treated fairly or leniently. They wanted to punish the South for causing the war and 600,000 deaths and the destruction and everything, right? And this goes to also the conflict over like executive versus congressional power too. You have the Wade Davis bill in 1864 where the radical Republicans pass it, basically telling Lincoln that Reconstruction is Congress's job, right? We are going to be making the laws that are going to govern this, and it's not really your job to be telling us what we're going to do or how to do it, right? So basically, these radical Republicans, who were a pretty large percentage of Congress at the time, were saying, you know, we're going to do it our way. Too bad if we don't like it.
And what these two divergent plans really show was Lincoln only requiring 10% and the Wade Davis bill requiring 50% allegiance, is it shows the two totally competing visions for a reconstructed United States. The Congress and the radical Republicans, like Mr. Minelski mentioned, are going to want to punish the Confederacy for what they had done. And you can understand to a certain extent why. Men like Sumner and Stevens viewed the Confederates as traitors to the American cause, creating a war that never needed to be fought, that has totally debilitated progress in the United States. And so they wanted to punish them, and they wanted to make sure that every Confederate state that joined the United States of America was going to be on board with emancipation and the freeing of African Americans in the South. And if they weren't, then they can't join. Because all of these radical Republicans were extremely worried about the South halting Reconstruction and basically doing everything they could to make sure that they re-implemented their Southern lifestyle of states' rights that they had prior to the war. The congressmen knew they would do it, and they wanted to do everything they could to stop them from doing it. And the last thing, real quick, in the Wade Davis bill, Congress also had like extreme safeguards for protecting emancipation. So if different areas of the Confederacy tried to take away the rights of freedmen, Congress would have laws in place to protect them.
Right. And so here you go. Lincoln's assassinated, and his vice president Andrew Johnson becomes president after his assassination. Right? And Johnson was kind of a candidate, a vice presidential candidate. He actually replaced Hannibal Hamlin was Lincoln's first vice president because Johnson was the only Southern senator that stayed loyal to the Union during the war. Right? He was from Tennessee, he was a slave owner, but he was pro-Union and he believed in Union, and that's why Lincoln kind of picked him as his vice president candidate to help shore up his ticket in the 1864 election. Okay? Johnson is, again, a slave owner, but does not like kind of the control that the planter class had over the South throughout the Civil War and leading up to it, right? He kind of wants to break that because he knows by breaking that kind of hierarchy in the South, he can help ensure the success of Reconstruction. But he doesn't really want to be much more lenient than Lincoln, or much more partial than Lincoln was, right? He kind of stuck to Lincoln's plans, what Lincoln wanted, kind of leniency. So in the end, he kind of was in the middle, right? The South didn't really trust him because he had never left, he had stayed Union the whole war, and the radical Republicans thought he was way too lenient on the South. They wasn't going to fulfill the plans, he wasn't going to go to the steps that they believed was needed to reconstruct the South.
And if you're looking at this slide and you're listening to Mr. Nelski and thinking, wow, this guy sounds really contradictory and hard to figure out, it's because he's really contradictory and hard to figure out. And one thing to keep in mind, like Mr. Nelski mentioned, while Andrew Johnson was pro-Union, he was very sympathetic to the Confederacy as a whole. He hated the super wealthy planters that he thought were running Southern government and ruining Southern government. He was very bitter towards them. But as a whole, he ends up being pretty lenient to the Confederacy because Andrew Johnson was not really that in favor of African American rights. Like Mr. Manelski mentioned, he owned slaves. He was racist. He thought African Americans were inferior to white Americans. So while, yeah, this is a pro-Union guy who was a Republican candidate, he is about as far from the radical Republicans as you could possibly get. And the freedmen in the South are going to suffer greatly because Andrew Johnson refuses to be as strict on the South as the Republicans in Congress wanted to. And what will happen is they will basically end up butting heads for his entire presidency.
Radical Republicans are called radical Republicans for the radical belief that black and white people should be equal.
Yeah. It isn't radical now, but back then it was very radical.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
So Johnson vetoes a lot of bills, and it's a big power match between the executive and legislative branch. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 66, the Freedoms Bureau. This goes through the radical Republican Congress and Senate, and Johnson vetoes it. Right? Which eventually Johnson kind of becomes a lame duck. In the midterm elections in 1866, the radical Republicans get a veto-proof majority in the House and Senate. Two-thirds, right?
Which you already know.
So he would veto laws, and then they would just pass them over his vetoes. So basically, this stuff ended up happening because they had a huge majority in the Congress.
Yeah, but the biggest issue is that all the momentum was right when the war ended. And that's when Congress had the momentum to make sweeping changes, like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and expanding the Freedmen's Bureau. And that's when President Johnson nipped it in the bud. And they lost a lot of this Reconstruction momentum, which really hurt Reconstruction. And one last thing before we move on, the Freedmen's Bureau is really important to know. I believe it's a bold word in your text. This is a group that the federal government created, which would go down to the South, and they would feed and clothe and educate freedmen, former African American slaves in the South, to try to give them some type of some skills to move up in society. Because at the time, following the war, they really had nothing.
Yeah, when they were freed, they were given freedom.
Yeah,
and that was it.
That was it.
They weren't given anything else. Right, so you were illiterate, you knew how to farm, then you knew how to pick cotton. That's what you've been doing your whole life. Yeah. And good luck.
Yeah,
and
basically what ends up happening, we won't belabor this point because we will get more into it in 12 too, But what they have to do is they have to end up relying on many of the southern planters who they lived amongst or who had enslaved them previously, because they really just had no other choice. Now, during Andrew Johnson's presidency, what Congress decides to do to make the former Confederates, these Southerners, abide by the 13th Amendment is they set up a military reconstruction. They create 5 zones in the South in which the military literally is running these Southern governments until and even after the Southern governments rejoin the United States. And throughout this time period, Congress passes the 14th and 15th Amendment, which gives slaves citizenship, 14th Amendment, and former slaves citizenship and the right to vote. So the Civil War amendments are the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which frees the slaves, gives them citizenship, and gives them the right to vote, which are drastic, sweeping changes.
I mean, that was really the radical Republican agenda, right? They wanted full equality, and there is nothing more equal than the right to participate in the democracy.
Yeah, and
the right to vote and make the law.
And the biggest issue here for many Southerners is that the way they planned on keeping down blacks in the South was by dominating local and state politics. They could pass laws that would basically keep them from obtaining any type of success, social or monetary. But the 15th Amendment, giving African Americans the right to vote, well, now that's going to be harder because they have the right to vote and they can control who takes over.
And as long as there's Union troops, those rights are going to be pretty well protected, especially when a lot of Union troops occupying the South are going to be black.
Exactly, yeah. And now one thing that we sort of alluded to, but the relationship between Congress and Andrew Johnson ends up blowing up at the end of his term. They are at an impasse, and they are sick and tired of each other. And Congress, trying to take power over Andrew Johnson, passes an act called the Tenure of Office Act, which basically means President Johnson cannot fire anyone in his cabinet without the approval of Congress. And Congress said, President Lincoln had to get our approval to hire them, thus you need to get our approval to fire them, which is something that you might not think is a big deal, but the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, who's a radical Republican, was pretty much running the military reconstruction, and he was angering Johnson in the process. So Johnson decides to fire him anyway, and basically sticks it to Congress.
Right, and Congress decides to impeach him, right? He's the first president to ever be brought up on this, right? And impeachment doesn't necessarily mean that you were removed from office, right? Impeachment means that you are officially charged with a crime by Congress, and because of his violation of the Tenure of Office Act, which is a law that they passed so that he would break it, they impeach him for it.
Yeah, they passed a law knowing he would break it. He broke the law knowing that they would be angry, but he actually came much closer to being kicked out of office than he wanted, survived by 1 vote. We've actually had 2 presidents impeached, Johnson and Clinton. Neither have actually been kicked out of office, although Nixon surely would have.
He quit before he got kicked out of office.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to wrap up 12.1 with shoving Johnson out of the presidency and welcoming a much more beloved Republican, the war hero Ulysses S. Grant, who wins overwhelmingly in the election of 1868. And you look at the map, and really unsurprisingly, he wins most of the northern states. But you see that Grant also wins many of the southern states. And that's because the freedmen, the former slaves in the South, vote in this election. And this is really an election in which they have more power than almost any other, because the South will put in, the South will implement different laws to prevent them from voting, but they hadn't yet. So the freedmen, between the 500 and 700,000 freedmen who voted, they actually helped push Grant to victory.
African Americans in the South in the late 1860s, early 1870s probably were the most politically and economically free that they were until after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty undisputedly. Right? We had black senators, black congressmen, black governors, black state representatives, and that's a lot of the reason because the Union Army was enforcing the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments.
And that's really important to keep in mind because the southern states will go out of their way to make sure they find all the loopholes they can and work around the Civil War amendments to keep African Americans from succeeding economically, socially, and politically during this time. If you have any questions, ask your history teacher. Thanks for watching.